Wow.
I can't believe it's still standing.
Daniel never believed in cursed houses. He believed in cheap property, old timber, cracked windows, and opportunities other people were too scared to touch. That was exactly why he stood at the rusted iron gate on Maple Hill Road with both hands on his hips, staring at the old two-story house everyone in town had been whispering about for years. The roof sagged a little on one side. The porch steps looked like they would groan under the weight of a cat. Every window was coated in dust so thick it made the glass look blind. Even in daylight, the house looked like it had swallowed too many secrets and was still hungry for more. Sarah stood beside him, hugging herself as the wind moved through the dead weeds in the yard. "Tell him again," she said to the realtor. "Tell him why it's so cheap." The realtor forced a laugh that sounded too thin to be real. "It's been vacant a long time, that's all. 40 years, give or take. Old plumbing. Old wiring. Needs a lot of work." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "That's not all." The woman shifted uncomfortably. "Some people in town say strange things about it. But you know how small towns are. Stories grow teeth." Daniel smirked. "Good. Then we're buying wood, walls, and free legends." Sarah turned to him. "Daniel, nobody leaves a house empty for 40 years for no reason. People do when they're dramatic," he said. "Or broke. Or both." The realtor quickly pulled out papers as if she wanted the sale finished before the house heard them talking. "Well, if you're still interested, I can." "We'll take it," Daniel said. Sarah's mouth fell open. "Just like that." He smiled at her, warm and confident. "Just like that. That should have been the first warning." The second came 3 days later, when Daniel and Sarah arrived with a borrowed truck full of cleaning supplies, tools, paint samples, flashlights, bottled water, and enough courage to pretend they were excited. The front door groaned when Daniel pushed it open, and a wave of stale air rolled out as if the house had been holding one long breath for 40 years and had finally decided to let it go. Sarah covered her nose. "Oh wow. That smell is terrible." Daniel coughed and waved dust from his face. "That, my dear, is the smell of potential. That is the smell of regret." He laughed and stepped inside first. The floorboards complained beneath his boots. The hallway stretched ahead into darkness, lined with peeling wallpaper that curled like old skin. An antique mirror hung crooked near the staircase, its surface so cloudy it barely reflected them. On the left was the living room, half lit by pale sunlight forcing its way through dirty curtains. On the right sat a dining room with a chandelier covered in cobwebs so thick it looked like it had been knitted by ghosts. Sarah moved closer to him. "Tell me the truth. This place is creepy, right?" Daniel looked around and shrugged. A little. A little. Fine. Blah. But creepy sells. Imagine this place when we're done. Fresh paint. New floors. Warm lighting. Flowers on the porch. It'll be beautiful." Sarah looked up the staircase. "And what if the town stories are true?" Daniel grinned. "Then we'll get even more value for our money." She smacked his arm. "This is why nobody argues with you for long." He set down a box of tools and clapped his hands once. "All right. Windows first. Fresh air. Then we start with the living room." They worked through the morning pulling open stiff curtains, sweeping years of dust into heavy gray clouds, and carrying out broken chairs, moldy newspapers, shattered picture frames, and one ugly lamp Sarah insisted was watching her. Around noon, Sarah stepped onto the porch with 2 bottles of water and froze. An elderly woman stood by the gate, staring at the house. She was thin, wrapped in a faded brown cardigan despite the heat. Her eyes stayed fixed on the upstairs windows, not on Sarah. Sarah walked down 1 step. "Hello." The woman slowly turned her head. "You moved in." "We bought it," Sarah said. "Well, we're fixing it first." The woman's expression tightened. "No one has stayed there since Margaret disappeared." Sarah felt a chill crawl across her arms. "Margaret?" The woman ignored the question. "If the walls start talking, don't listen." Sarah blinked. I'm sorry, what? But the old woman had already turned away. She shuffled down the road without looking back once. Daniel came out carrying a rotten wooden shelf. Who was that? Sarah stared after the woman. I don't know. But she said nobody stayed here since Margaret disappeared. Daniel set the shelf down. There it is. What? The free legend package. Sarah didn't smile. She wasn't joking. He studied her face for a moment, then softened. Hey, people say strange things when something sad happened somewhere. It doesn't mean the house is haunted. Did I say haunted? You were thinking it loudly. She exhaled and handed him the water. Let's just keep working. Inside the house, the air felt different after that. Heavier. More watchful. Even Daniel noticed it, though he refused to say so. Every sound seemed sharper now. The scrape of a chair leg. The slam of a window. The creak from upstairs when nobody was there. By late afternoon, they had made decent progress in the living room. Daniel was pulling off strips of faded floral wallpaper, while Sarah sorted through a box of items they had found in a built-in cabinet. Most of it was trash. Old buttons. Dead batteries. Cracked ashtray. Receipts so faded the ink had nearly vanished. Then Sarah found the photograph. It was black and white, slightly bent at the corners, and dusty from years of neglect. She brushed it clean with her thumb and stared. Daniel! He kept pulling wallpaper. Look at this. He turned and walked over. The photograph showed the house exactly as it looked decades ago, only cleaner, brighter, alive. Fresh curtains hung in the windows. Flowers lined the porch. Standing in front of the door was a woman in a long dress, one hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Both of them were smiling. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were the words, Margaret and Elias. Summer 1986. Sarah swallowed. That must be her. Margaret, Daniel murmured. Then who's Elias? The boy, I guess. Sarah kept staring at the child's face. Why would someone leave this behind? Before Daniel could answer, a loud thud came from somewhere above them. Both of them froze. Sarah grabbed his arm. You heard that? He nodded slowly. Yeah. That came from upstairs. It's probably the house settling. It sounded like footsteps. Daniel reached for the flashlight on the table. Stay here. Sarah stared at him like he had lost his mind. Absolutely not. If something is up there, we're both seeing it together. He almost smiled. That's my girl. They climbed the staircase slowly, the wood creaking under every step. The hallway upstairs was long and narrow, with 3 closed doors and 1 window at the far end. Dust floated in the beam of Daniel's flashlight like tiny ghosts drifting in water. Daniel! Sarah whispered. Why does it feel colder up here? Broken windows, maybe. You don't believe that. He didn't answer. He pushed open the first door. Empty bedroom. Torn curtains. Rusted bed frame. Second door. Smaller room. Child-sized dresser. Peeling wallpaper with faded stars. Sarah stepped inside and looked around. This must have been Elias's room. On the floor beneath the window sat a toy truck covered in dust. She picked it up carefully. Oh no! What? It's like they just left everything. Daniel turned the flashlight toward the closet. The door was half open. Inside hung 3 tiny shirts and a coat, still on their hangers. Sarah's voice shook. People don't leave like this unless they were forced to. Daniel's jaw tightened. Let's check the last room. The third door stood at the very end of the hall. Unlike the others, it was locked. They stopped in front of it. Sarah whispered. Why is this one locked? Daniel grabbed the knob and twisted. It didn't move. Then, from the other side of the door, came a sound so soft Sarah almost thought she imagined it. A scrape. Like something dragging lightly across the floor. Sarah stumbled back. Daniel! He lifted the flashlight higher, eyes fixed on the door. There's nobody in there. The scrape came again. Longer this time. Slower. And then, just beneath the door, A tiny folded piece of yellowed paper slid out onto the hallway floor. Sarah covered her mouth. Daniel bent down, picked it up with trembling fingers, and unfolded it. On the paper, written in shaky faded ink, were 4 words. "Don't let him find it. Batch 2. Sarah's knees nearly gave out. She stared at the note in Daniel's hand as though the paper itself might suddenly catch fire. The hallway had gone so quiet that even their breathing sounded too loud. Daniel read the message again, slower this time, his face tightening with every word. "Don't let him find it," he whispered. Sarah shook her head. No. That was in there. Somebody pushed that out from under the door." Daniel looked down at the narrow gap beneath the door. Dust lay thick along the floorboards except for the small line where the paper had slid through. He crouched and shone the flashlight under the door, but the beam showed almost nothing beyond darkness and what looked like the leg of an old table. "There's no one in there," he said, though the confidence in his voice had weakened. "Then where did the note come from?" He stood up again, gripping the flashlight tighter. Maybe it was already near the door. Maybe air from the broken windows moved it. Sarah stared at him. Air unfolded a paper and pushed it toward us right after we heard dragging sounds. "Daniel, please stop pretending this is normal." He looked at the note one more time. The handwriting was unsteady, rushed, almost panicked. Whoever had written it had not been calm. That much was obvious. "We need to open this door," he said quietly. Sarah blinked. "You say that like it's a good idea. We can't leave it like this." "Why not?" "Because if we walk away now, we'll spend the whole night imagining what's in there." Sarah folded her arms tightly. "I'm already imagining too much." Daniel handed her the note. "Hold this." She took it reluctantly. "What are you doing?" He stepped back once, measured the weakness of the old frame with his eyes, then drove his shoulder hard against the door. The wood groaned but held. Sarah jumped. "Daniel!" He stepped back again and hit it a second time, harder. This time the latch cracked but still didn't give way completely. "One more," he muttered. "Maybe we shouldn't." He slammed into it a third time. The door burst inward with a violent crack and banged against the wall. Dust exploded into the air. Sarah coughed, covering her mouth, while Daniel swept the flashlight across the room. Nothing moved. No person. No animal. No hidden intruder. Just a small bedroom frozen in time. The curtains were drawn shut, leaving the room dim and stale. An old vanity mirror stood in one corner with a layer of dust so thick it looked painted over. A narrow bed leaned against the wall beneath a faded quilt. A dresser sat opposite it, its top lined with bottles, brushes, and a dried vase full of dead stems. On the floor near the center of the room was a single wooden chair tipped on its side. Sarah slowly lowered her hand from her mouth. "There's no one here." Daniel walked in first, cautious now, his flashlight moving across every inch of the room. That scraping sound must have been the chair. How would it move by itself? He did not answer. Sarah stepped in behind him, still clutching the note. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, not just by a little but by enough to sting her skin. The air had a strange smell too, not mold, not rot, but something dry and forgotten, like old paper locked in a drawer too long. Daniel stopped at the vanity. There, resting on its dusty surface, lay another photograph. He picked it up and wiped it clean with the edge of his shirt. It was Margaret again, older this time, standing alone on the porch. She wasn't smiling in this one. Her eyes seemed fixed on something outside the frame. On the back were 2 words written in the same faded ink they had seen downstairs. "He knows." Sarah took a step closer. "That's the same handwriting." Daniel nodded. "Yeah." A sudden gust pushed through somewhere in the room, and the curtains lifted slightly. Sarah flinched and turned toward the window. One side of the frame had been cracked open just enough to let the wind in. "Maybe that's what moved the chair," Daniel said, more to comfort himself than her. Sarah walked to the bed. The quilt was coated in dust except for one section near the edge where the dust looked thinner, disturbed. Her face tightened. Daniel. He turned. Look at this. He came over. She pointed to the mattress. There, almost too faint to notice, was a shallow depression, as if something or someone had once sat there for a long time. Course, after 40 years that should have meant nothing. Old springs sag. Mattresses settle. But nothing about the room felt ordinary enough for simple explanations anymore. Sarah swallowed. This room feels wrong. Daniel forced a breath through his nose. Let's not stay in here longer than we have to. He moved to the dresser and pulled open the first drawer. It stuck at first, then gave with a groan. Inside were folded clothes, yellowed with age but neatly arranged, like someone had expected to come back for them. The second drawer held letters tied together with a ribbon that had almost turned to dust. He looked at Sarah. Bingo! She came beside him as he carefully lifted the bundle. The envelopes were all addressed to Margaret Hale at the house on Maple Hill Road. Most had never been opened. The stamps were old, the postmarks dated over several years. Read one, Sarah whispered. Daniel chose an envelope already split at the edge and slid the letter out carefully. The paper crackled in his hands. He scanned the first few lines, then frowned. What? Sarah asked. It's from someone named Ruth. Says Margaret needs to leave town before it gets worse. He read further, his voice low. She says people are talking. Says the sheriff keeps visiting. Says if Margaret has proof, she shouldn't keep it in the house. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. Proof of what? Daniel flipped to the bottom. It doesn't say. Read another one. He opened a second letter. His eyes moved quickly, then slowed. This one's weirder, he said. Weirder than that note. He nodded. It says, I told you he would never stop looking. Men like him don't bury secrets. They bury people. Sarah grabbed his arm so hard he winced. Who is he? Daniel looked around the room as though the walls might answer. I don't know. Sarah turned toward the closet. Check there. He hesitated. You check. Her eyes widened. Daniel. He gave a weak smile. Fine. He crossed the room and pulled the closet door open. Inside hung several dresses covered in plastic so brittle it cracked at the edges. A pair of shoes sat neatly beneath them. On the top shelf rested an old hatbox. Daniel reached for it carefully and brought it down. He set it on the bed and lifted the lid. Inside was a journal. Not a diary exactly. Not like the kind someone writes in every day with neat little entries. This one looked rougher, more urgent, with pages stuffed inside at odd angles, scraps of paper sticking out, and sections marked with symbols and underlines. Sarah whispered, That has to be Margaret's. Daniel opened to the first page. On it, in dark blue ink, were the words, If anything happens to me, the house will tell the rest. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel turned the page. The writing inside was messy, rushed, sometimes slanted so hard it nearly ran off the page. Some sections had dates. Others didn't. The first few pages described Margaret's fear. She wrote about a man who came around the property asking questions. A man who was respected in town, trusted, protected. A man who smiled in public and threatened in private. Daniel read aloud. His voice almost a whisper now. He thinks I only saw part of it. He doesn't know I saw everything. Elias heard him that night. I know he did. That's why I can't let Elias out of my sight anymore. Sarah frowned. So the boy knew something too. Daniel kept reading. I told the sheriff, but he looked at me like I was the liar. Either he's afraid of him or he's helping him. I don't know which is worse. Sarah took a step back. This is bad. This is really bad. Daniel flipped several pages. More names appeared. Ruth, Elias, Sheriff Donnelly. Someone referred to only as him. Always underlined, always avoided, as if Margaret feared even writing his name. Then Daniel reached a page where the handwriting suddenly changed. The lines were shakier. Ink had smeared in places like tears or sweat had fallen onto the page. He read slowly. He came to the porch again tonight. He said I should stop digging into things that do not concern me. He said old houses are good at swallowing people and stories. I locked every door, but I know locks will not be enough. If he comes back and I do not have time, then the first part is in the wall behind the roses. The second. Daniel stopped. Sarah leaned in. The second what? The bottom of the page had been ripped away. No, Sarah cried. No, no, no. That can't be it. Daniel quickly flipped to the next page, but it was blank. So were the next 3. Then near the middle of the journal, another entry appeared. This one was shorter. Far more disturbing. Elias keeps asking why the man in the car watches the house, Daniel read. I told him not to look out the windows anymore. Tonight he said he saw the man smiling. Children should never have to describe evil with such certainty. Sarah pressed a hand over her mouth. That poor boy. Daniel turned another page. Then another. Suddenly a folded sheet slipped out and landed on the floor. Sarah picked it up. It was a rough hand-drawn map of the downstairs level of the house. The living room. The kitchen. The back hallway. The basement stairs. Small X marks had been drawn in 3 places. Daniel stared. This changes everything. Behind the roses, Sarah whispered. What does that mean? There aren't any roses anymore. Maybe there used to be. Sarah looked toward the door. Daniel. Maybe we should stop reading this in here. Yeah, he said, voice tight. Yeah, we should. As they turned to leave, Sarah glanced at the vanity mirror. For the briefest second, she thought she saw someone standing in the hallway behind them. She gasped and spun around. But the hallway was empty. Daniel rushed to her. What happened? I thought I saw. You saw what? She looked back at the mirror. Only their reflections stared back now, pale and shaken. Nothing, she lied. Let's just go downstairs. Please. They hurried out of the room with the journal, the letters, the photograph, and the note. Daniel shut the broken door behind them, though neither of them could explain why. Maybe to keep something out. Maybe to keep something in. Downstairs, the fading daylight made the living room feel a little safer, but not much. Daniel spread everything across the old dining table while Sarah locked the front door, even though she knew a week-old lock meant nothing if the fear was already inside the house. Daniel tapped the hand-drawn map. 3 X marks. Margaret hid 3 things. Sarah pointed at one. This one has to be the wall, right? The first part she mentioned. He nodded. And if that's true, then there's more hidden here than we thought. Sarah looked toward the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. Do you think the secret is about a murder? Daniel did not answer immediately. Finally he said, I think whatever Margaret found got her killed. Daniel stared at the hand-drawn map like it had just accused him of something. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers as the last rays of sunlight slipped through the dirty living room windows. Outside, evening had begun creeping across Maple Hill Road, and the quiet of the town suddenly felt heavier than it had earlier in the day. Sarah leaned closer to the table. The first part is in the wall behind the roses, she repeated slowly. Daniel nodded. Yeah. But there are no roses outside. There might have been 40 years ago. Sarah looked toward the window that faced the front yard. The weeds there had grown wild and tall, covering most of the ground like a rough green blanket. What if they were planted right outside the living room wall, she said. Daniel followed her gaze. Then his eyes slowly widened. Behind the roses, he whispered. Sarah turned toward the section of wall where they had earlier removed pieces of wallpaper. That's exactly where we found the metal box. Daniel grabbed the journal again and flipped through the pages quickly. She said the first part was behind the roses, he said. That means the diary we found earlier must be the first piece of whatever she was hiding. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Which means the other 2 X marks on the map are the second and third pieces. Daniel tapped the map again. 1 X was drawn near the kitchen hallway. The other was marked beside the basement stairs. Sarah stared at them both. I don't like either of those places, she said quietly. Daniel forced a grin. Good thing we're not scared of old houses. Sarah gave him a look. Speak for yourself. Just then. Knock. The sound hit the front door so suddenly that both of them jumped. Sarah grabbed Daniel's arm. Did you hear that? Yeah. Another knock followed. Slower this time. Knock. Daniel frowned. That's someone at the door. Sarah lowered her voice. Who would come here this late? Daniel walked toward the door carefully and peered through the dusty glass. He froze. Sarah whispered urgently. Who is it? He opened the door halfway. Standing on the porch was the same elderly woman Sarah had seen earlier near the gate. Her expression looked far more serious now. You shouldn't stay here after dark, she said immediately. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. Evening to you too. The woman looked past him into the house, her eyes scanning the hallway like she expected someone else to be there. You opened her room, she said. Daniel and Sarah both stiffened. How do you know that? Sarah asked. The woman stepped forward slightly. Because the window light changed. Daniel crossed his arms. You've been watching the house. For 40 years, she said calmly. Sarah blinked. What? The woman finally looked at them properly. My name is Ruth. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. Ruth, he repeated. Sarah gasped softly. The letters. Ruth nodded slowly. Margaret wrote to me before she disappeared. Daniel stepped aside. You better come in. Ruth hesitated only a moment before walking inside. Her eyes moved around the living room as though she were stepping back into a memory she had spent decades trying to forget. When she saw the journal and papers on the table, her face drained of color. You found it. Sarah nodded slowly. In the bedroom closet. Ruth ran a trembling hand across the back of a chair before sitting down. I always wondered if she managed to hide everything, she murmured. Daniel leaned forward. Everything about what? Ruth looked at both of them. You really don't know what happened here, do you? Sarah shook her head. All we know is Margaret disappeared. Ruth let out a bitter laugh. That's what the town was told. Daniel felt a chill run through his spine. What actually happened? Ruth took a deep breath. 40 years ago, Margaret Hale discovered something terrible. Something that could have destroyed the reputation of the most powerful man in this town. Sarah's voice dropped. Who? Ruth looked toward the window as if making sure no one outside could hear. Sheriff Donnelly. Daniel blinked. The sheriff. Ruth nodded. He was the law here for nearly 30 years. Everyone trusted him. Everyone respected him. Her eyes darkened. But Margaret saw something she wasn't supposed to see. Sarah leaned forward. What did she see? Ruth looked down at the journal. She saw him burying a body. The room went completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Daniel whispered, You're serious? I wish I wasn't. Sarah's heart began pounding. Who was the body? Ruth shook her head slowly. We never found out. But Margaret saw everything from her bedroom window that night. She told me the next morning. Daniel swallowed. Why didn't she report it? She tried. Ruth's voice tightened. But the sheriff was the one she had to report it to. Sarah covered her mouth. Daniel looked down at the map again. So Margaret started collecting evidence. Ruth nodded. Yes. She hid it in the house. Yes. Sarah pointed to the 2 remaining X marks. Then there are still 2 pieces left. Ruth stared at the map. Her eyes widened slightly. Oh no. Daniel frowned. What? That means you've only found the beginning. Sarah whispered. What's the rest? Ruth looked toward the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. The rest is what proves what Margaret saw. Daniel stood up immediately. Then we're finding it tonight. Ruth grabbed his wrist. No. He turned back. Why not? Because if that evidence is still here. Her voice dropped. Then the person who tried to destroy it might still be looking for it. Sarah frowned. But Sheriff Donnelly is probably dead by now. Ruth slowly shook her head. No. Daniel blinked. What do you mean no? Ruth looked directly at him. He died 10 years ago. Sarah sighed in relief. But Ruth continued speaking. He had a son. Daniel's stomach sank. And that son, Ruth said quietly, became the new sheriff. The silence that followed felt like ice spreading through the room. Sarah whispered, "You think he knows about this?" Ruth looked toward the front door. "I think he's been waiting 40 years to make sure nobody ever finds it." At that exact moment, a pair of headlights slowly swept across the front windows of the house. All three of them froze. Sarah whispered urgently, "Someone's outside." Daniel moved quickly to the window and peeked through the curtain. His heart nearly stopped. A dark sheriff's patrol car had just pulled up beside the road. Inside the car sat a man watching the house. Daniel stepped back slowly. "It's him." Sarah's voice shook. "The sheriff." Daniel nodded. "And he's been sitting there long enough to see the lights on in here." Ruth stood up quickly. "He knows someone is inside." Sarah whispered, "What do we do?" Daniel looked at the map again. Then toward the hallway. Then back toward the patrol car outside. Finally he said something that made both women stare at him like he had lost his mind. "We finish what Margaret started." Ruth shook her head. "That's dangerous." Daniel grabbed the flashlight. "So is leaving the truth buried forever." Sarah took a deep breath. "Then we do it fast." Daniel pointed to the kitchen hallway. "The second X is there." Ruth looked terrified. "You have no idea what you're stepping into." Daniel turned toward the hallway anyway. "Maybe not." He clicked on the flashlight. "But Margaret did." And somewhere outside the house, the sheriff slowly stepped out of his car. The beam of Daniel's flashlight cut through the dark hallway as he moved toward the kitchen. Behind him, Sarah followed closely, clutching the journal against her chest. Ruth trailed a step behind them, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting nervously toward the front windows every few seconds. Outside, the faint crunch of gravel echoed as the sheriff's boots touched the ground. Sarah whispered urgently, "He's getting out of the car." Daniel didn't stop walking. "Then we don't have time to hesitate." The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house, the kind of cold that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The kitchen door stood slightly open, swaying gently from the evening breeze slipping through a cracked back window. The old wooden cabinets looked untouched for decades. A rusted sink sat beneath a window coated in grime. The linoleum floor had curled at the edges like brittle paper. Daniel looked down at the map again. "The second X is somewhere around here." Sarah glanced toward the basement door at the far end of the kitchen. "Please tell me that's not where it is." Daniel followed her gaze. The basement door stood closed, its dark wood scarred with scratches and dents. Ruth's voice trembled. "Margaret always said the basement was where the sheriff buried his secrets." Daniel slowly turned back to the kitchen floor. "Let's check here first." He knelt down and ran the flashlight across the boards beneath the old kitchen table. Most of the planks looked the same, aged, dusty, cracked with time. But one of them looked slightly newer than the rest. Daniel tapped it with his knuckles. "Bunk." Sarah leaned down beside him. "That sounds hollow." Daniel grabbed the crowbar from the tool bag he had brought earlier and wedged it into the edge of the board. "Stand back." With a sharp pull, the plank lifted free. Dust exploded into the air as the board snapped loose. Beneath it sat a narrow metal tin. Sarah's heart pounded. "That's it." Daniel lifted the box carefully and set it on the table. Ruth's hands trembled as she reached toward it. Margaret must have hidden this after she saw the burial. Daniel opened the tin. Inside were several folded documents and a small cassette tape. Sarah frowned. "A tape." Ruth picked up the documents. Her eyes widened. "These are land records," she said quietly. Daniel looked confused. "What does that prove?" Ruth flipped through the pages quickly. "They show who owned the farmland outside town 40 years ago." Sarah blinked. "Okay, and..." Ruth's voice shook. That farmland is where Margaret said the sheriff buried the body. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. So this is proof that he owned the land. Yes, Ruth said. And if someone searches there. She stopped mid-sentence. Outside the house, a heavy knock suddenly slammed against the front door. Bang! Sarah gasped. He's here. The knock came again, louder. Sheriff's office. A deep voice shouted. I know someone's inside. Ruth whispered frantically. You have to hide that evidence. Daniel looked at the basement door. The third X. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You want to go down there right now? Another thunderous bang hit the front door. Open this door. Daniel grabbed the cassette tape and the documents. Come on. He rushed toward the basement door and yanked it open. A wave of cold air poured up from the darkness below. The wooden stairs creaked as he stepped down. Sarah followed immediately, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Behind them, Ruth shut the basement door just as the front door upstairs burst open. The sheriff's angry voice echoed through the house. Hello! Daniel's flashlight revealed a narrow dirt basement lined with stone walls. Old shelves leaned against the corners, filled with rusted tools and broken jars. He checked the map again. The last X is right under the staircase. Sarah pointed at the ground. Right there. Daniel dropped to his knees and began digging through the loose dirt with his hands. Above them, heavy footsteps moved across the living room floor. The sheriff was inside. Sarah whispered urgently. Hurry! Daniel's fingers suddenly struck something solid. He brushed away the dirt. A wooden box emerged from the ground. That's it, he breathed. He pulled it free and lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of old photographs. And a small revolver. But it was the photographs that made Sarah gasp. Each one showed the same horrifying scene. A man standing beside a freshly dug grave in the middle of a field. The man holding the shovel. The man looking directly at the camera. Sheriff Donnelly. Daniel flipped over the final photograph. Written on the back were the words, If you're reading this, then I never escaped him. Sarah whispered. Margaret took these pictures. Suddenly, the basement door upstairs creaked open. A beam of light flooded the staircase. Well, well, a voice called down calmly. Sheriff Donnelly's son stood at the top of the stairs, gun drawn. You've been busy. Daniel slowly stood. Sarah clutched the photographs. The sheriff descended the stairs step by step. My father told me someone might come looking one day, he said casually. Ruth's voice echoed from upstairs. Your father was a murderer. The sheriff smirked. And yet the town loved him. He looked at the evidence in Daniel's hands. That belongs to me. Daniel didn't move. It belongs to the truth. The sheriff raised the gun. Truth doesn't matter when nobody is left to tell it. Suddenly, a loud crash came from upstairs. The sheriff turned his head for a split second. In that moment Daniel lunged forward. The gun fired. The shot echoed through the basement walls. Sarah screamed. But the bullet hit the stone wall behind them. Daniel tackled the sheriff, sending both men crashing into the dirt floor. The revolver skidded across the basement. Sarah grabbed it immediately. Stop! Both men froze. Sirens suddenly wailed outside the house. Ruth appeared at the top of the stairs shouting, I called the police. The sheriff's face went pale. Minutes later, officers rushed into the basement and pulled him away in handcuffs. One officer looked at the photographs and shook his head slowly. This is enough to reopen everything. As the patrol cars drove away later that night, Daniel and Sarah stood on the porch staring at the old house. 40 years of silence had finally been broken. Margaret's secret had survived. And now the truth would finally be told. Sarah exhaled slowly. Do you think the house is done with its secrets? Daniel looked back at the dark windows. Then he said quietly, I think the house was just waiting for someone brave enough to listen. If you enjoyed this story, Make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling us what you would have done if you found that first hidden note.